I sat in church, holding proof of a life I lived. She looked at me and said, "You were never my father," so I stayed quiet and let the truth answer for me. The first crack came quietly, like something settling wrong behind the walls. I was standing in my kitchen with the smell of pumpkin pie in the air, the kind that usually means safety, when my wife told me I was not going to a meeting that mattered. Her voice casual, practiced, like she had already accepted the shape of the lie. I remember nodding even as my chest tightened. Because after 17 years you learn when speaking will only make things worse. I had just come off a long day at work. Hands smelling like metal and insulation, boots damped from slush. The kind of ordinary evening that never warns you it is about to change your place in the family. She kept smoothing the dough, avoiding my eyes. And I felt that slow realization settle in that decisions had already been made without me. Decisions about who belonged and who was easier to leave out. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I had built a life on patience, on doing things right the first time. Wires either carry current or they do not. Families are supposed to work the same way. But when she said my stepdaughter wanted her biological father there instead, wanted things to look a certain way, something cold moved through me. Not anger, not yet. Just the understanding that years of showing up had been reduced to inconvenience. I thought about early mornings, school drop-offs, late-night phone calls, bills paid without discussion, the 1,000 small acts no one applauds. And I wondered when those had stopped counting. She said it was complicated, that word people use when the truth feels heavy. And I stood there realizing I had just been quietly reassigned, from father to background, without a vote. That night I barely slept, not from shouting or fighting, but from the weight of what had not been said. The house felt different, like a room after furniture has been moved. Familiar but wrong. I replayed conversations, searched for the moment things shifted, and found nothing loud enough to blame. Just a steady pattern of choosing what was easiest. I did not confront anyone, not yet, because I still believed silence might protect what was left. But deep down, I knew something had already been severed. When morning came and light crept across the kitchen floor, I understood this was not about one meeting. It was about being slowly erased while still standing in the room. And that realization, quiet and controlled, was the true beginning of everything that followed. The next morning did not bring relief. It brought confirmation, the kind that settles in your gut and refuses to move. I was standing by the counter watching the coffee maker struggle through its last breath, when my phone lit up with a notification I almost ignored. A picture posted late enough to feel intentional. My stepdaughter smiling beside her mother and her biological father. Arms close, faces bright, like a scene rehearsed for an audience that did not include me. The caption called him Dad. Just that simple word, offered freely, publicly, like it had never belonged to anyone else. My hand stayed steady, but my ears rang. The way they do when you realize something important has already happened without you. When my wife walked in, robe loose, hair undone, she saw my face before she saw the screen. She did not ask what was wrong. She already knew. She offered explanations that sounded reasonable if you did not look too closely. She said my stepdaughter was excited that this was important for her future, that families like his expected certain things. And every sentence carried the same message, that my feelings were secondary to appearances. I asked once where I fit into this picture. Not loudly, not accusing, and she looked away. That silence told me more than any argument could. It was not confusion. It was agreement. And in that moment I understood that exclusion was not an accident. It was a decision repeated until it felt normal. My stepdaughter came in soon after, bright voice, quick steps, perfume cutting through the smell of coffee. She spoke like nothing had changed, like the ground had not shifted under my feet when I asked about the meeting. About why I was not there, she shrugged, impatient, and said it was easier this way, easier for everyone. And when I asked what that made me, she exhaled, like I was asking something unreasonable. Then she said it, clean and sharp. "You were never my father." The words did not echo. They landed heavy and final. My wife said nothing. The room stayed warm. The coffee hissed. The ordinary world continued like it always does. and I felt something inside me shut down quietly. Not anger, not grief yet. Just a switch flipped to off. I told her I understood. Because at that point I did. I understood that fighting would only make me look desperate. That explanations were no longer wanted. And as I put on my jacket and walked out, I realized this was no longer about correcting them. It was about deciding who I was going to be now that they had decided who I was not. I did not leave that morning in anger. I left because staying would have taught them nothing. The apartment I moved into was small and temporary, or at least that is what I told myself. A place to breathe while things cooled down. But even in that first quiet night, I could feel the difference between distance and erasure. Distance still assumes return, erasure does not. The walls were bare, the silence unfamiliar, and yet my routines stayed intact. Boots lined by the door, keys in the same bowl, coffee set up the night before. Habits built over decades do not disappear just because your role does. I slept light, waking to every sound. Like part of me was still on watch. The next day the messages started. Not worried, not apologetic, just irritated. Asking why I was being distant, why I was not responding. As if my absence was a malfunction instead of a response, I read them without replying. Because sometimes silence is the only language left that still has meaning. Then another notification came through, another post. This one tagged by friends and relatives, comments stacking up beneath it. Congratulations, so proud. What a beautiful family. And there again was the picture, her smiling, her mother beside her, and the biological father placed exactly where I used to stand. It was not just that I was missing, it was that the story worked better without me. And that realization cut deeper than any insult could have. I sat at the small table and scrolled longer than I should have, seeing years of quiet presence overwritten by a cleaner narrative, one that fit better into wedding photos and polite conversations. And I thought about how easy it is to replace a man who never demanded credit, who never raised his voice, who believed doing the work was enough. I remembered signing papers without hesitation, fixing things without being asked, showing up without being thanked, and I wondered when that turned into invisibility. When being reliable became being forgettable. I did not comment, did not defend myself, because arguing online would only cheapen what I had given. And deep down, I knew the truth did not need my performance to exist. That night, I walked through the apartment, touching the small signs of order I had already created, the lined-up shoes, the folded jacket, the calendar on the counter with dates written in neat blocks. Proof that my life still had structure, even if my family no longer acknowledged it. I sat down and let the quiet settle, not as punishment, but as clarity. This was no longer about a single comment or a single post. It was about a pattern of convenience, about choosing the version of events that asked the least of them. And for the first time, instead of trying to earn my place back, I felt something steadier take hold. A decision to stop explaining myself to people who had already decided I was expendable. They came to the apartment 2 days later, not to apologize, but to confront me for being quiet. The knocking was sharp and impatient, the kind that assumes you owe someone access. I stood in the narrow kitchen for a moment, watching the second hand on the wall clock pass the 12. Tick by tick, before opening the door, my wife stepped in first, coat half-zipped. Eyes already charged with frustration, my stepdaughter followed close behind. Phone in her hand like she might need proof of something. Neither of them asked if this was a good time. They rarely did anymore. The questions came fast. Why I was not answering, why I was being cold, why I was acting like something had been done to me. The room felt smaller with them in it. Their voices filling the space where my calm had been settling. I listened without interrupting, because I wanted to hear how they explained it to themselves. My wife said I was overreacting. My stepdaughter laughed and said I was making myself into a victim, and when I finally spoke, my voice surprised even me, steady, low, clear. I said you went without me, you replaced me, and you told people I was never really there. The word betrayed slipped out then, not shouted, not accused, just named. And the silence that followed was immediate and sharp. My stepdaughter rolled her eyes and said it was not like that, that appearances mattered, that her fiancé's family expected stability and tradition, and it had been easier this way. I asked easier for who, and she hesitated just long enough to tell the truth without saying it. My wife rubbed her temples and said she was trying to protect everyone, smooth things over, keep the future from getting complicated. And that was when it landed. I was not being erased because I had failed. I was being erased because I complicated the picture. Because my presence required explanation, and explanation required honesty, something they were no longer willing to manage. I could feel years of unspoken moments lining up behind my teeth. Every late night, every fix, every time I stood in when someone else did not. But I did not list them. I did not raise my voice. Instead, I stepped aside and opened the door. The movement surprised them more than shouting would have. I said I was done talking about this, not because I was wrong, but because I finally understood there was nothing left to clarify. My wife stared at me like she did not recognize who I was anymore. My stepdaughter muttered something about maturity. And then they left, the door closing hard behind them. When the sound faded, the apartment felt larger, quieter. And for the first time since all this began, I did not feel hollow. I felt resolved. Because I had finally stopped trying to prove my worth to people who only valued me when I stayed silent. After they left, I did not sit in the apartment long. The silence was clean but heavy, the kind that makes you restless if you stay in it too long. I grabbed my jacket, lined my boots like always, and drove without a plan until muscle memory took over. The VFW on East State Street had been there longer than most of the people in my life. A place where no one asked you to explain yourself unless you wanted to. The sign buzzed faintly in the cold, and when I stepped inside, the warmth hit me slow and familiar. The smells were the same as they always were. Old coffee, worn wood, decades of cigarette smoke soaked into the walls from a time before apologies. A few men sat scattered at tables, coats over chairs, voices low, unhurried. Nobody rushing to be impressive. Miller looked up from his mug and nodded once. Slid a cup toward me without a word. Black coffee. Strong enough to remind you where you were. He asked if I was all right, and I said family stuff. And that was enough. At places like this, people understand that family can hurt worse than any enemy. And they do not pry. I sat there longer than I meant to, staring out the window as snow started to fall, light at first, then steadier, covering East State Street like it was trying to soften the edges of everything. I thought about long nights on watch years ago, about standing still in the cold because that was your post, about how discipline is not about punishment, it is about responsibility. And I realized that was the difference between me and them. I had stayed at my post long after it became inconvenient. They had walked away the moment it complicated their story. The thought did not make me angry. It made me clear. That was when my phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number? I almost let it go to voicemail. But something told me to answer. The woman on the other end introduced herself carefully. Said she was my stepdaughter's future mother-in-law, her voice polite but measured. She asked if I had a moment, and I said I did. She told me she had been under the impression I was only a roommate. Someone temporary, not really part of the family. The words hit hard, but they also confirmed what I had already felt. The story had been rewritten completely. I corrected her calmly, not with anger, just facts. I said I married her mother when she was 9, that I raised her, that I was there. There was a long pause on the line. And when she spoke again, her tone had changed. She thanked me for being honest, and when the call ended, I sat there, with the coffee cooling in my hands, understanding that staying silent was no longer neutral. It was permission, and that if the truth was going to exist at all, it would only do so if I stopped protecting people who had already decided to erase me. I did not sleep much that night, not because of anger, but because my mind kept circling the same realization that my silence had been useful to everyone but me. The apartment was dark, except for the faint glow of the clock on the wall, numbers changing with a soft click. Marking time whether I was ready or not, I replayed the call in my head. The careful way she asked her question, the pause when the answer did not match what she had been told. It was the first time an outsider had noticed the gap, and that mattered more than I expected. The next morning, I sat at the small table with my coffee and pulled open the drawer where I kept paperwork. Not looking for leverage, not looking to build a case, just grounding myself in what was real. Papers do not argue back. They do not shift when it is convenient. The first thing I found was the car loan paperwork, my signature clear and steady. I remembered the day, her nervous smile, the way she hugged me too quick like she was embarrassed to need me. Then a medical bill folded tight. Numbers that had made my wife cry at the time. And me writing a check without comment, because that is what family does. I laid them out slowly. Not in anger, just acknowledgement. As the pile grew, something inside me settled. These were not memories to weaponize. They were proof that I had lived my life consistently. Whether anyone else chose to remember it or not, I thought about how easy it is for people to reshape the past when no one pushes back. How lies gain weight simply because they are repeated. And I understood now that my refusal to correct them had allowed the version of events that suited them best to solidify. It was not cruelty on their part, it was convenience. And convenience is powerful when left unchallenged. Later that afternoon, another message came in from the same woman. An invitation, polite, formal, asking if I would attend a small family meeting at their church before final wedding plans moved forward. She said they wanted everyone on the same page. The phrase made me almost smile, because I finally understood what page I had been written out of. I did not respond right away. I folded the papers back into a thin folder, neat, careful, the way I do everything, and set it by the door. I was not planning a confrontation. I was preparing for a question. The difference mattered to me. That evening, I stood by the window watching cars move through slushy streets. Headlights blurred by falling snow, and I made a quiet decision. I would go not to defend myself, not to accuse anyone, but because I was done being spoken about without being present. If they wanted a clean story, they were going to have to include the truth. I did not owe them silence anymore. I owed myself accuracy. And for the first time since being told I was never her father, I felt steady again, not because things were fixed, but because I had stopped shrinking to fit a lie that was never mine to carry. The folder stayed by the door all week, thin and unassuming, and every time I passed it, I reminded myself why it existed. Not as a threat, not as leverage, but as a boundary. I went to work like normal, early mornings, cold air biting through my jacket, hands busy with wires that did not care about feelings or family politics. There was comfort in that. Electricity follows rules. It does not rewrite history to suit the moment. And by the time Sunday came, my mind was quieter than it had been in weeks. That morning I moved slow and deliberate, showered, shaved. Put on the jacket I reserve for situations that matter. The one without stains, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because self-respect shows in small choices. The apartment felt still, almost respectful, as if it understood this was not a day for rushing. I picked up the folder, felt its light weight, and for a moment considered leaving it behind. Trusting memory alone, but memory can be dismissed as emotion. Paper cannot, so I took it with me, tucked under my arm like something fragile. The church parking lot was half full when I arrived. Sensible cars, muted colors, the kind of place where people assume decency by default. I sat in my truck for a full minute, hands on the steering wheel, breath fogging the windshield, not stalling, just centering in the Navy. Before inspections, you check yourself one last time. Not out of fear, but pride, I straightened my jacket, stepped out into the cold, and walked inside. The smell of coffee and lemon cleaner hit me immediately. Familiar and faintly antiseptic, folding chairs lined up unevenly. Already filling with people who believed they knew the full story, I saw them before they saw me. My wife sitting stiff, eyes scanning the room. My stepdaughter glued to her phone, her biological father relaxed. Already comfortable, already placed, something in my chest tightened. But I took a seat near the aisle, neutral ground, not hiding, not pushing forward. The folder rested on my knee. My hands folded over it, steady. My wife noticed me then, leaned over and whispered that she hoped I would not make this harder than it needed to be. I met her eyes and said I would not speak unless asked. And I meant it. I was not there to perform. I was there to exist, as the meeting began. Polite words filled the room. Dates, plans, guest lists, surface-level harmony. And I listened the way I always had, quietly letting others take up space. But inside I felt something different than before. Not small, not defensive, just present. I realized then that the folder was not the important part. The important part was that I had finally stopped pretending my absence was accidental. I was there now, visible, grounded, and whatever happened next. The truth would not have to chase me anymore. I was already sitting in the room with it. The meeting started the way polite gatherings always do. With careful smiles and soft voices that pretend nothing sharp is coming, Evan's parents stood near the front. Thanking everyone for coming, talking about unity and clarity, words that sound harmless until you realize they are often used to smooth over discomfort. I stayed quiet in my chair, back straight, hands folded over the folder, listening as plans were discussed like facts already settled. Dates, venues, guest lists, assumptions layered one on top of another, each one built on a version of the family that did not include me. Darren spoke easily, like someone used to being deferred to. He laughed at the right moments, made comments that landed well. And every time he referred to himself as father, no one corrected him. Not my wife, not my stepdaughter, not even Evan, who looked increasingly uneasy the longer it went on. I watched that discomfort grow, the way a man shifts when something does not align with what he was promised. I said nothing, because truth has weight on its own. It does not need help, it just needs space, and I could feel the room tightening as the story stretched thinner. Eventually, Evan's father cleared his throat, a small sound that cut through the chatter, and he looked around the room with a careful expression, the kind men use when they are about to ask something that matters. He said there was one thing he wanted to clarify, something that had been bothering him since their earlier conversation. His eyes settled on me, hesitated, then held. And in that moment, the air changed. The coffee urn clicked loudly behind us. A chair shifted. The room leaned in without meaning to. He asked how long I had been part of my stepdaughter's life. The question simple, direct, unavoidable. I did not rush my answer. I let the silence stretch just enough to make it clear I was not guessing. I said 17 years. I said I married her mother when she was 9. Darren shifted, opened his mouth like he wanted to qualify it. But Evan's father lifted a hand and asked me to continue, so I did, calmly, without emphasis. I said I was there. I said I showed up, and I stopped, because that was enough. That was when I opened the folder. Not dramatically, not all at once, one paper at a time, explaining each without commentary. A car cosign, a medical bill, a graduation program. Facts presented without accusation. The room stayed silent. My stepdaughter's face drained of color. My wife stared at her hands, and Evan looked at her with something broken behind his eyes. He said quietly that this was not what he had been told, and the hurt in his voice landed heavier than any argument ever could. I closed the folder and rested my hands on it again, not victorious, not relieved, just aware that the truth had finally been allowed to finish its sentence. After Evan spoke, no one rushed to fill the silence. It sat there thick and uncomfortable, the kind that makes people suddenly aware of their own breathing. I stayed still in my chair, eyes forward, hands resting on the closed folder. I had said what was asked, nothing more. The truth does not need embellishment. It only needs to be allowed to stand. Across the room, Darren leaned back, like he might laugh it off. But the sound never came. His confidence had thinned, and everyone could feel it. Evan's mother broke the quiet first. Her voice careful but firm, she asked why none of this had been shared before. Why they had been given a version of the family that erased 17 years? My wife spoke then, barely above a whisper, saying she did not think it mattered, that she was trying to keep things smooth. The word landed wrong this time. No longer comforting, just small? Evan shook his head slowly, eyes never leaving my stepdaughter, and asked her if she had known all along. The question was not angry, it was wounded, and that made it worse. My stepdaughter tried to explain, saying it was complicated. saying she did not want things to be awkward, saying she thought everyone would understand. But her words came out tangled, each one pulling against the last. The room watched as the story she had relied on collapsed under its own weight. Darren tried to reclaim ground, saying biology mattered, that he was her real father. And I felt the urge to respond rise in me, but I did not. Because the moment was no longer about me. The truth had moved past needing my defense. Evan stood up slowly, running a hand through his hair. His face tight with disappointment. He said he needed air. That he could not process wedding plans built on something this wrong. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply named the damage and stepped away from it. The door closed behind him with a soft final sound. And that was when the weight of consequence settled in. No shouting, no drama. Just the realization that choices had reached beyond intention and could not be called back. I sat there until the meeting dissolved around me. People standing, whispering, avoiding eyes. The orderly world they had expected slipping out of alignment. When I finally stood, the folder felt lighter than it had earlier. Not because it mattered less, but because it had done its job. My stepdaughter would not meet my eyes. My wife looked like she wanted to say something and could not find the right version of it. I nodded once, not in forgiveness, not in victory, just acknowledgement. And as I walked toward the door, I understood something clearly. Patience does not mean passivity. It means waiting until the truth has room to speak, and then stepping aside so it can be heard without interruption. The fallout did not arrive all at once. It seeped in quietly, like cold through a house with poor insulation. The morning after the meeting, my phone started buzzing with missed calls and careful messages. People asking how I was holding up, voices lowered like grief might be contagious. I listened to a few voicemails, then let the rest sit. Because there was nothing left to explain, the truth had already done the talking, and repeating it would not make it gentler for anyone involved. My wife called late that night, her voice thin, stretched. She said she was staying with her sister for a while, that she needed time to think. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the light above me. I asked time for what, and she said for everything. For the marriage, for the family, for how things had gotten this far. Then she said what she had really called to say. That I had embarrassed our stepdaughter, embarrassed her, embarrassed everyone. I let the words settle before answering. I said I had answered a question in a room I was invited into. Nothing more, nothing less. She accused me of bringing paperwork to make a point, of turning a family issue into a spectacle, and I reminded her that the story had already been shared publicly without me. Rewritten in ways that suited them, I asked her what she expected me to do when directly questioned. Lie better than they had? The line went quiet. And in that silence, she admitted something she had not planned to. That Darren had been speaking to our stepdaughter for months, shaping her expectations, talking about appearances and traditions. She said she did not think it would go this far, and that was when clarity finally replaced hope. I told her about standing watch years ago, about how you do not abandon your post just because it gets uncomfortable, about how responsibility does not disappear when it becomes inconvenient. She cried then, but I did not soften what I said, because softness would have been another kind of lie. I told her I was done being optional, done shrinking myself so things could stay smooth. And when we hung up without saying goodbye, I knew the marriage I thought I had was already over, not because of one meeting, but because of years of quiet compromise that had finally reached their limit. 2 days later, I sat across from a loan officer at the credit union. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, snow turning the parking lot outside into gray slush. I said I wanted things clean, not punitive, just clear. We went through accounts, obligations, where my name still mattered and where it no longer should. I signed away the emergency fund I had set aside for my stepdaughter years ago. No conditions, no speech, because she would need it, even if she no longer needed me attached to it. And as I walked back out into the cold, the wind cut sharp and honest, the kind that hurts for a second and then wakes you up. And for the first time in weeks, I could breathe without bracing for the next blow. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful exactly, but steady, the kind of quiet that lets you hear yourself think. I settled into routines that did not depend on anyone else's approval. Work in the mornings, coffee in the same mug. Evenings spent fixing things that did not need fixing, just to remind myself I still could. The apartment began to feel less temporary, not because I decorated it, but because I stopped waiting to leave. Messages from my wife slowed, then stopped, not with a fight, but with distance. The most honest ending we had managed in years. I did not block her, did not reach out either. Some spaces close on their own when you stop forcing them open. From time to time, I wondered if my stepdaughter thought about the meeting, about the moment the story fell apart, but I did not chase that thought. Accountability works best when it is allowed to echo without interference. One afternoon, I returned to the credit union to finish paperwork, the kind that finalizes decisions and makes them official. The clerk spoke kindly, asked if everything was all right, and I said it would be, because it already was. Not easy, not painless, but honest. Walking back to my truck, I felt the weight of years lift slightly, not because I had been validated, but because I had stopped negotiating my place in other people's lives. A message came in from an unfamiliar number that evening, my stepdaughter's fiancé. He said he wanted to apologize for not seeing what was happening sooner, for accepting a version of events that made his life simpler. He said the wedding was still on hold. The trust once cracked takes time to rebuild. I thanked him for saying it directly, because directness matters. And I told him I hoped they figured things out. Not for my sake, but for theirs. When I set the phone down, I felt no urge to respond further. Some conversations do not need continuation to be complete. That night, I sat at the small table and opened my pocket calendar, flipping ahead, not looking for big plans, just marking ordinary things: oil change, doctor appointment, a fishing trip I had postponed for years, the simple architecture of a life lived on your own terms. I thought about all the years I had stayed quiet to keep peace, all the times I chose patience over recognition, and I understood something that felt like closure. Dignity does not come from being acknowledged. It comes from knowing you did your part even when no one was watching. And as I closed the calendar and turned off the light, the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. The diner off North Main Street had not changed in years. The kind of place that keeps the same cracked booths and burnt coffee because it works. Snow lined the curb outside in uneven piles. Gray at the edges, honest about where it had been. I was already there when he walked in, sitting by the window, jacket on the hook, hands wrapped around a mug that kept my fingers warm. Habit and comfort in small things. He hesitated when he saw me, like he was not sure he was allowed to sit down. Then he did anyway. He said he wanted to speak face to face, that it mattered. His voice was steady but tired, the way a man sounds when he has been carrying disappointment longer than he expected. He told me the wedding was on hold, not canceled. Not moving forward, just paused, because his family cared about honesty, and because he could not pretend the truth did not matter once he knew it. I listened without interrupting, stirring my coffee slow, watching steam rise and disappear. Some truths do that. They linger just long enough to be felt before they fade. He said my stepdaughter was scared, that she did not know how to fix what she had broken, that she wanted me to know she was sorry, but did not know how to say it herself. He slid his phone across the table, a short message on the screen. Simple, unpolished, thanks for everything. I stared at it longer than I needed to, feeling both the weight of it and the limits. Apologies do not rewind time, but they do mark a moment of recognition. And recognition, when it finally comes, can stand on its own. I told him something I had learned the hard way, that being a father was never about a title. It was about consistency, about showing up when it was boring, when it was inconvenient, when no one was clapping. I said sometimes people choose one story because they think it erases the other, but life does not work that way. He nodded like he understood, maybe not fully, but enough to carry it forward. And when we finished our coffee, there was no awkwardness, just a quiet respect that did not need to be explained. When I stepped back outside, the cold hit sharp but clean, the kind that clears your head. I stood there for a moment, watching my breath drift away, thinking about all the nights I waited up, all the bills paid without comment, all the moments that never made it into anyone else's version of events. And I realized something that finally felt like peace. Telling the truth had cost me a marriage, but it had given me back myself. And as I walked to my truck, I knew my worth no longer depended on someone else saying my name. It was already written into the way I lived every single day.